You want to judge somebody, you want to find out whether they're cool or not. If they want something from you, they're going to be nice to you.
At 85 years old, James Garner finally revealed a bitter truth he had carried for decades. It was not about fame, fortune, or even Hollywood politics. It was about a woman the world adored, Doris Day. And what he said about her stunned even his closest friends. In the early 1960s, James Garner and Doris Day lit up the silver screen in a way that few pairs could. Audiences fell in love with their sharp comedic timing, flirtatious banter, and magnetic chemistry in films like The Thrill of It All and Move Over, Darling. They were the picture-perfect couple for light-hearted romantic comedies, glamorous, charming, and seemingly in sync. But while the public adored them together, the reality behind the scenes was far less polished. Even during filming, some crew members whispered that things were not quite as warm between the two stars as the final edits suggested. Garner was known for being low-maintenance, direct, and not one to play Hollywood games. Doris Day, on the other hand, was America's sweetheart, a carefully curated image that, according to Garner himself, did not always match her actions behind the camera. They came from different corners of the industry. Garner, the rugged television star turned leading man, and Day, the wholesome box office darling shaped by studios who needed her to be perfect at all times. Their first collaboration in The Thrill of It All was a commercial success, but Garner would later hint that working with Day was anything but thrilling. In interviews years later, he would smile politely when asked about her, offering carefully chosen praise. But his private journals told a different story. He noted moments on set that rubbed him the wrong way, and there were frequent references to what he called Day's calculated charm. One particularly telling entry from the time reads, "She knows how to get what she wants, and she knows when to play innocent." That is the dangerous part. That line alone paints a much more complex picture than the one Hollywood tried to sell in press tours and promotional photos. What is even more revealing is how consistently Garner returned to the subject of Day in his writings, as if something about that working relationship had left an impression far deeper than he liked to admit. Studio executives, ever aware of public perception, leaned into the idea that Garner and Day were close friends. They posed them together off-set, manufactured playful interviews, and used their chemistry to push ticket sales. For a while, it worked. But as the years went on, Garner's silence on Day became more noticeable. When co-stars and directors would reflect on working with her, Garner's name was conspicuously absent from her stories. He, in turn, rarely brought her up unless prompted. And even then, his praise was brief and strangely clinical. What exactly went wrong between them? Why did a man who got along with nearly everyone in Hollywood go so cold when it came to Doris Day? According to those close to him, it all began with one day on set, a single moment that would leave Garner feeling blindsided and ultimately betrayed. And what happened during that moment would set the tone for everything that came after. It was during the filming of Move Over, Darling that things took a dramatic turn. James Garner, ever the professional, insisted on doing most of his own stunts. He believed it added authenticity to his performances and had built a reputation as someone willing to put himself on the line for a good take. But one particular scene pushed that reputation to its limits and exposed something in Doris Day that he would never forget. The scene required Garner to perform a physical gag involving a bathtub, a slippery floor, and a poorly timed fall. On paper, it was typical romantic comedy slapstick. In reality, it was far more dangerous than anyone realized. During the shoot, Garner slipped harder than intended and landed awkwardly, dislocating his shoulder and tearing ligaments. The crew rushed in, cameras were cut, production halted. But what stuck with Garner most was not the injury itself. It was Doris Day's reaction. According to multiple accounts from the set, Day barely moved. She stood there, distant and impassive, as crew members scrambled around the fallen actor. Some said she turned away. Others said she simply looked on with an expression that Garner would later describe as detached. While no one could say for sure what she was thinking in that moment, Garner was stunned. He expected at least a gesture of concern, a quick check-in, something, but he claimed it never came. Later, in his autobiography, Garner recalled the moment with unusual clarity. "I was lying on the floor in pain, unable to move my shoulder, and I remember looking up and seeing Doris just standing there. Nothing in her eyes, no concern, no reaction. That told me more than words ever could." That sentence, more than any tabloid rumor or gossip column, revealed just how deep the hurt went. In interviews years later, Day was asked about the incident. She brushed it off lightly, saying that Garner was a tough guy and laughed it off like always. But Garner never laughed it off. He missed several days of filming and required physical therapy for months afterward. The pain in his body eventually healed, but, according to him, the wound to his pride, and more importantly, to his perception of Doris Day, never did. Some insiders claimed that Day was simply overwhelmed, that she froze up in the moment. Others speculated she was frustrated with the long hours and just wanted to get through the day. But Garner believed it was something else, something colder. He felt she saw the moment as an inconvenience, not a crisis. And once he believed that, there was no going back. From that day on, their interactions were civil, but guarded. The warmth that audiences believed in was carefully maintained for the cameras. But when the director yelled, "Cut!" the distance between them was palpable. Garner, who had always prided himself on being easy to work with, found himself pulling away. And while he never confronted her about it directly, he carried the memory of that silence for decades. It was a turning point, not just in their professional relationship, but in how Garner viewed Day as a person. He never made a public scene, never launched into a scandalous interview, but he would later say that the moment taught him exactly who she really was. And from then on, every decision he made around her would be colored by that belief. After the success of their first two films together, studios were eager to pair James Garner and Doris Day again. The public loved them, the box office numbers proved it, and their names together practically guaranteed a hit. But one highly anticipated project would never see the light of day. And what happened behind the scenes drove a wedge between them that never healed. Garner had already signed on, and production was moving forward when word came down that Doris Day had abruptly dropped out. No warning, no explanation, just a quiet withdrawal that left producers scrambling and Garner blindsided. He had reportedly championed Day for the role, believing their past chemistry would make the film another success. Her sudden exit felt like more than a scheduling conflict. It felt personal. Insiders close to the production claimed that Garner was livid. He felt humiliated, left in the lurch by someone he thought he could at least rely on professionally. Worse, rumors spread that Day had made a private deal with another studio for a solo project that clashed with the one Garner had committed to. Whether it was a better payday or an attempt to avoid working with him again, the result was the same. Garner was left holding the bag. What stung most, he later admitted, was the silence. No phone call, no apology, no explanation. Just a quiet exit, as if the film and his involvement meant nothing at all. Friends said he took the move personally, seeing it as a clear message that Day no longer wanted anything to do with him. After that, Garner reportedly began turning down scripts that had her name attached. He did not want to go through that again. For years, the public never knew any of this. The film was quietly canceled, and the press chalked it up to creative differences. But behind the scenes, the fallout was real. Garner withdrew further from any association with Day, and while he remained gracious in public, his private comments told a much different story. When asked decades later if he would ever work with her again, Garner's response was brief and blunt. Once was enough. It was a loaded answer from a man who rarely spoke in absolutes, and that silent rejection marked the point of no return. In 1976, Doris Day released her autobiography, a glossy, best-selling memoir that painted her life in soft pastels. Fans praised its charm and vulnerability, and for many, it was the closest they ever got to knowing the real Doris. She shared stories of her upbringing, her rocky marriages, and the pressures of fame. It was open in tone, but selective in content. And for James Garner, the book said more in what it left out than in what it revealed. In over 300 pages, Day mentioned Garner only in passing, just a few flattering lines about how wonderful he was to work with. No stories, no shared memories, no hint of their deeper connection or past tension. For someone who starred opposite her in two of her most successful films, the omission was striking. And to Garner, it felt like a deliberate erasure. Privately, he was furious. He had expected at least some acknowledgement of the years they spent together on set, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. But instead, it was as if he had been airbrushed out of her story entirely. Those close to him said he felt insulted, even mocked, by how little space she gave him. A man who had played a central role in two of her most iconic performances was now little more than a footnote. What made it worse, in Garner's eyes, was that the book was filled with warm recollections of other co-stars, Rock Hudson, Cary Grant, even some lesser-known actors who had worked with her only once. Garner was not just omitted. He was singled out by that very absence. It was not just what she failed to say, it was who she chose to talk about instead. Garner was not one to demand the spotlight. He valued honesty. He believed stories should be told with all their messiness, not just the parts that made someone look good. In his eyes, Day's memoir was carefully curated, shaped to preserve a public image that had little room for inconvenient truths. To him, she had taken control of the narrative, and she had done so by quietly erasing the parts that did not fit her carefully drawn portrait. In contrast, when Garner released his own autobiography years later, he included a chapter about his time working with Day. It was not bitter, but it was brutally honest. He described their chemistry on screen as real, but said their connection off-camera was strained, polite, and mostly professional. He wrote that he never truly understood her, and that something always felt just slightly off when they were alone together. There was no malice, just unresolved tension that lingered like a question never answered. The stark difference between their two accounts only deepened the divide. While Day's fans celebrated her book, Garner's words landed like a quiet thunderclap, unexpected and unsettling. Some saw it as a final dig. Others saw it as a man finally telling the truth after years of keeping up appearances. But to those who knew how he had carried that silence for decades, it was more than that. It was closure. Delayed, perhaps, but sincere. And for those who read between the lines, it was clear. Garner believed Doris Day had rewritten history and left him out of it. And once history was rewritten, there was no turning the page back. In classic Hollywood, silence often spoke louder than scandal. And in the case of James Garner and Doris Day, the silence from their mutual friends told its own story. Actors, producers, and directors who had worked with both stars rarely commented on their relationship. It was not just out of respect, it was because nobody wanted to get in the middle of something they did not fully understand. Rock Hudson, one of Day's closest friends, remained particularly tight-lipped whenever Garner's name came up. Though he had worked with both stars and was often considered the bridge between their two worlds, he never offered insight into what went wrong. That silence only fueled speculation. Some believed Hudson knew more than he let on, especially about off-camera disputes that never made it to the tabloids. Others in Day's circle followed suit. Directors who had worked on her films gave glowing quotes about her charm and warmth, but conveniently skipped over Garner when reminiscing. Meanwhile, Garner himself, known for being candid, chose restraint. That in itself was telling. He would speak his mind about nearly everyone else in Hollywood, but with Doris, his tone shifted. There was frustration, yes, but also something heavier, disappointment, maybe even sadness. Over time, rumors swirled. Some speculated that the tension between Garner and Day may have had personal roots beyond just a professional falling out, a failed romance, a secret argument, a broken promise. No one could say for certain, but those close to both stars admitted the energy between them was complicated, even years after they had stopped working together. What added another layer to the mystery was the way Day continued to be celebrated in Hollywood. She was honored repeatedly, praised as one of the last great icons of a bygone era. Garner never publicly objected, but sources said he bristled at how easily she seemed to escape criticism. She could charm the world, one friend of Garner's recalled, but that charm never worked on Jim again. In the court of public opinion, Day remained untouchable. Garner, meanwhile, carried the weight of an unresolved past that no one wanted to talk about. And while he never tried to tear her down, he also never let go of the feeling that something important between them had gone unspoken, and that silence would linger until the very end. As the decades passed, James Garner remained a respected figure in Hollywood, graceful in aging, quiet in retirement, and beloved by fans who remembered him as a leading man who never played by the rules. He largely stepped away from the spotlight, choosing to live out his later years privately. But at 85, in an interview that few expected, and even fewer were prepared for, Garner finally addressed the one name that had shadowed his legacy for decades: Doris Day. The interview was not planned as a confessional. It began as a retrospective, a look back at a storied career. But as the conversation turned to the golden era of romantic comedies, the interviewer mentioned Day, almost casually. For a moment, Garner went quiet. Then, with a sigh, he said words that would shock even those closest to him. "I never truly forgave her." It was not said with anger. It was quiet, reflective, almost sad. Garner explained that forgiveness had never been about the injury on set, or the canceled film, or even the erasure from her memoir. It was about something deeper, a betrayal of trust. She knew what she did, he said, and she never once owned up to it. Not even a phone call, not a word. He admitted he had carried the resentment longer than he should have, that it had lingered not because of hatred, but because of disappointment. "We had a chance to be something great," he said. "Not just on screen, but maybe even off it. But she closed that door, and I never got to ask why." The confession took the interviewer by surprise. This was not the typical Hollywood grudge, not the fiery feud tabloids loved to exaggerate. It was something colder, quieter, a wound that had never closed because the person who caused it had never acknowledged it existed. Garner's words stirred emotions among fans and fellow actors. Some defended Day, insisting she must have had her reasons. Others empathized with Garner's sense of abandonment, recognizing in his words a lifetime of holding back. But the confession was never meant to start a war. It was simply a man, nearing the end of his life, telling the truth as he saw it. He ended the topic with a sentence that lingered in the air long after the interview ended. "Sometimes, the people who hurt you the most are the ones you least expect." And by then, it was far too late for either of them to fix it. When Doris Day passed away in 2019, tributes poured in from all over the world. She was remembered as a radiant star, a timeless voice, and a beacon of Hollywood's golden age. Her death brought a wave of nostalgia and reverence. But for James Garner, who had passed just a few years earlier, it left behind an unfinished story that would never be resolved. Garner's confession, though quiet, had cast a new light on their legacy. Fans began to rewatch their films, searching for subtle signs of tension, wondering what had really happened behind those playful smiles and perfect comedic timing. But whatever had existed between them, hurt, misunderstanding, resentment, died with them. There would be no apology, no letter unearthed, no last-minute reconciliation. The door was closed forever. In the years since, biographers and film historians have tried to piece together what went wrong. Some believe the rift was professional, rooted in clashing personalities and unspoken egos. Others think it was personal, maybe even romantic, something more vulnerable that neither star ever wanted to discuss publicly. But the truth remains elusive. Doris Day never addressed Garner's later comments. It is unclear whether she ever even heard them. She had grown famously private in her later years, rarely giving interviews and focusing mostly on her animal advocacy work. By the time Garner finally opened up, she had already faded from public life. If she had regrets, she never voiced them. And so, the mystery remains. Two of Hollywood's brightest stars, forever linked by two classic films and decades of speculation, left behind a legacy as dazzling as it is incomplete. Their chemistry on screen was real. That much no one doubts. But the distance behind the curtain tells a more haunting story. Missed chances, wounded pride, and a silence that spoke louder than any script. In the end, perhaps it was not about blame. Perhaps it was about two people shaped by an industry that demanded perfection, forced smiles, and silence in the face of pain. What they shared on screen brought joy to millions, but what they left unsaid tells a very different story, one that may never truly be understood. And maybe that is the most human part of all.